Okay, welcome to session 4 and the final session of our online conference. I'd like to particularly welcome the Americans, who it's now morning, and so they've joined us. The Australians, the rest of us have been going for quite a long time. It's now 11:10 p.m. in Australia, so I'm sure there's a few Australians who've dropped off the screen while the Americans have been getting up. Okay, so we have another 3 great papers, and I would like to invite Natee to share your screen with us, please. Natee will present a paper on the age gap in mortgage access.
So in this talk, we're trying to answer one research question, which is, what is the relationship between age and credit access? So for academics, I think this is an interesting question because little work has been done on the topic, data limitations. And so I'm hoping to fill that gap with a new data set. And for policymakers, I think this is interesting because the US population is aging very quickly, and to the extent that credit access is important for quality of life, knowing this empirical relationship might be informative for the policies that we want to make. The motivation behind this paper is mainly from the seminal work by Monell et al. In 1996, which was the first paper sort of document systematically that mortgage access is unequal across racial groups. And so I'm trying to do the same thing but for age. And so hence I'm using a large data set of mortgage applications to document several conditional correlations, which number one is the correlation between age and rejection probability. And then the second one is age and coupon rates. And then if we have time, we're going to try to discuss potential explanations for the systematic correlations that I will show you. So the data set is the confidential HMDA data set from 2018 to 2020. And I'm limited to these years because starting from 2018, HMDA started collecting age information about borrowers. And for those of you who are not familiar with this data set, it's basically a regulatory data set collected by the Fed and the like that covers about basically almost the entire mortgage market in the US. So it's very representative. So this gives me the exciting opportunity to document the systematic correlation between age and sort of credit access for a large market. So this paper can be broken down into 2 parts. The first being the rejection study. And for this part, I'm looking at 5 million refinance mortgage applications associated with single borrower. And I'm looking at single borrower applications because it's much simpler, because for cases where there are 2 borrowers, it's more difficult to think about whose age I should be looking at. And I focus on refinance applications because at the end of the day, I'm trying to estimate conditional correlation. And so I think the selection concern in this sample is less severe than the sample for home purchase mortgages because of, renter versus homeowners that I cannot distinguish in the data. And in the second part of the paper, I'm using a sample of about 3 million originated mortgages that were sold to Fannie and Freddie, the GSEs in the US that sort of securitize these mortgages. And the reason for the sample selection will be clear in about 2 slides. So for the first part of the paper, I'm going to run the simple OLS regression, just following this literature on unequal mortgage access, where a rejection dummy variable is regressed onto a vector of age group variables. The age groups that I have here are 18 to 24, 25 to 29, so on up to 70 plus. And then I'm going to have a vector of control variables that are standard to literature. So these are things like income, credit score, DTI, LTV, and the like. And I also observe a bunch of loan characteristics, property characteristics. And so this regression will, of course, give me the conditional correlation between rejection probability and age. And so, again, it's not a causal relationship, but since this is the first paper to look at this relationship, it's still very informative. So for the coupon rate study part of the paper, I'm going to follow the identification strategy from Bartlett et al. 2022, which exploits this thing called the loan level pricing adjustment grid, which is a grid schedule that the GSEs use to price mortgages that they buy. So it's just a table of credit score on one axis and LTV on the other axis. And depending on where the particular mortgage falls in that grid, it determines the fees that originators have to give to the GSEs when they sell the loans. And so by law, this grid is the only thing that can determine the coupon rates if the loans were originated to be sold to the GSEs. And therefore, this allows me to run OL's regression where coupon rates is regressed onto, again, the age group dummy variables and other demographic variables such as gender and race, and then include this month by grid fixed effects. And so any statistically significant loading on the demographic variables is indicative of significant difference in coupon rates across demographic groups that has nothing to do with unobservable credit quality, which is the main concern for this type of regression. And in the Bartlett paper, of course, they looked at race and they interpret the significant loading on the race variable as loosely as discrimination, but of course, it covered things like shopping behavior or market segmentation and the like too. So, okay, so this is the main result for the rejection probability part of the paper. So I want you to focus on column 1. The notable pattern here is that conditional on observables, you see this increasing relationship between age and rejection probability. So the coefficient increases from negative 50 basis points to about 5.5%. So the total gap between the oldest age group and sort of the 25-29 age group is about 6%, which is large compared to the unconditional rejection probability of 17.5%. Column 2 includes lender by year, quarter fixed effects, and we still see the same result, which means that this pattern can't really be explained by the story that older applicants are more likely to apply for mortgages at lenders who are unconditionally more stringent. Of course, the literature on unequal mortgage access has been mainly focused on race, so it's worth comparing the coefficients on the age variables to race variables. And what I find is that the coefficient magnitudes are similar, which suggests that when it comes to the determinants of mortgage application outcomes, age is sort of comparably important in rates. And columns 3 and 4, I'm just doing a simple exercise where I leave out one set of demographics just to see whether it matters for the remaining set. And what I find is that it does not matter. You know, in column 3, I leave out the age variables and the coefficients on Hispanic and Black is the same, which means that the prior literature that did not have access to age information, you know, the conclusions from those papers would be unlikely to change. So just some additional results. The qualitative pattern holds if I drop COVID-19 or 2020 from the regression. And the pattern also shows up across loan types, so conforming loans, non-conforming loans, and government guaranteed loans. And then the pattern also shows up in catch-up refis. And here, I'm showing these results is to show that, you know, number one, this pattern is robust, and second, it's quite ubiquitous. So in the interest of time, let me skip a few slides. Okay, so this table shows the baseline results for the coupon rate study. So once again, I'm using the identification strategy that relies on the assumption that if I add loan level pricing adjustment fixed effects, what's left for the loadings on the demographic variables is indicative of significant differences in coupon rates across groups that has nothing to do with unobservable credit quality, because, you know, beyond the grid, lenders do not care about anything else. And once again, similar to the rejection probability result, you see that the coefficients from the 25-29 age group sort of increases almost monotonically down to the 70+ age group. The total gap here is about 10 basis points, which compared to the the ratio gap in coupon rates that the Bartlett paper found about 9 basis points. So again, very similar magnitudes. And the remaining columns here just shows, the results with different types of fixed effects, just to show you that this again is robust. And I forgot to mention that for this table I'm showing you, the sample is home purchase mortgages that's been sold to Fannie Mae. And here I can use home purchase mortgages because, once again, if you believe the identification strategy, then the selection issues I was concerned with before, so less of a concern. So once again, the result also holds for mortgage refis, and also holds when I drop COVID-19 from the sample. And of course, there's another big GSE, which is Freddie Mac, and they use a slightly different grid, pricing grid, and so I have to run the regression separately, but of course, the results also hold there as well. So once again, just to recap, older applicants tend to face higher barriers to mortgage access, both at the application stage and also once their mortgages has been originated, they seem to also be paying more beyond, unobservable credit quality. Let me skip these. Okay, so we're at the last part of the paper where I discuss potential explanation. So of course, for the first part of the paper where I show you this high rejection probability, I'm only showing you correlations. And so the result should be interpreted as, conditional correlations that's could be driven by any combination of these reasons that I show you here or other reasons that I might have omitted. So of course, number one, selection or omitted variable bias could be driving the results because, of course, the sample of mortgage applicants is a selected sample where, younger applicants in the sample is likely to be very weird because, young people are less likely to own homes and even less likely to refinance their mortgages. And so these young people might just be like very high in credit quality, and vice versa for the older applicant, because anecdotally, older individuals do not like to carry debt into retirement. And so it's possible that these older applicants in my sample are just sort of, special in a bad credit kind of way. And so that might be driving part of the results. Age-related mortality risk is another potential explanation where when in the United States, when a borrower dies, the mortgage is either prepaid through asset sales or goes into foreclosure if there's no heir or an asset sale doesn't cover the whole debt. And so, of course, for older applicants, probability of death is a real risk for lenders because if lenders care about prepayment risk or foreclosure risk, that has to be binding. And so that might drive the result as well. A third potential explanation is unintended differences in outcome from demographic blind models, such as machine learning models. There's a paper that showed that, raised blind models can yield different results for different racial groups. And so the same thing could be going on here for age. And then lastly, case-based age discrimination could be going on, but I'm not confirming or ruling that. For the coupon rate result, if we believe the identification strategy, then I've taken care of the omitted variable bias, and therefore what's left are things like differences in shopping behavior across age groups, or sort of differences in degree of competition across, different segments of the market that might be correlated with age. And then lastly, again, case-based discrimination could be going. So let me conclude. So today, I hope I've convinced you that there's a positive, and robust relationship between age and rejection probability among refinance mortgages. And then for a large part of the home purchase and refi mortgage market, once those mortgages are originated, older individuals also pay high coupon rates beyond their sort of observable or unobservable credit quality. And so the main implication is that at least for researcher, age seems to be very important for these types of regressions. And so you should probably condition on age if that's possible. And then lastly, many mechanisms drive this documented facts. And so I hope that this paper is a good starting point for a rich literature on why age matters for mortgage access. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jason from the Investment Company Institute, also from the US. Jason's presentation is very interesting in the Australian context, actually. So, do people successfully manage their nest eggs through retirement? And I'm very interested to see the data that you'll be presenting in this presentation. So thank you, Jason. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This work is joint with Sarah Holden, who is with us observing this morning. So good morning, Sarah, and good morning to everybody here. The views expressed through this presentation represent our own as authors, and they are not the views of the Investment Company Institute, its staff, or member firms. Let's see, how do I get this thing to go forward now? There we go. All right, so just as an overview, there are many concerns in the retirement space. It's a sort of a multidimensional space, of course. One is financial literacy. We saw a very nice presentation on choice architecture in the last session. And specifically in this context, is there such a thing as non-strategic accumulation? Do people just willy-nilly spend down their assets? Then there's self-control. Maybe they want to do the right thing, but they just lack the ability to do it. 3, how do they contend with macro financial shocks? Are they caught off guard by surprises that do them meaningful harm? 4, what about health-related financial shocks? Do they wind up with very large hospital bills that incapacitate them not only physically, but also financially? And then finally, 5, what about cognitive declines? And so when you think about this space and in this variety of concerns that have been brought up in other literatures, you might think, well, how generally do these risks impact financial well-being? Are there data? Is there a way for us to study this? And this is what Sarah and I are fundamentally motivated to do. We want to improve understanding in how people manage their resources in retirement. All right, now in the US, our system has many components in it. That's true, I think, in Australia and in most of the world as well. People tend to rely on multiple components that they have in order to consume and experience life in retirement. So how are they doing managing these components? And to Hazel's question up front, the data that we're bringing to this are the health and retirement study data. Those are US data source that's been conducted since 1992. And RAND has built a very nice panel. We're going to use that panel through 2016. And then we're going to add data from two more enhanced HRS modules, the full 1996 survey, and then 20 years later, the 2016 survey. And these are called FAT files or flat files if you look for them online. All these data are public, by the way. Now, more on these data in terms of quality. Dushi and Trendkamp have found that the HRS data are generally of very high quality. And there has been prior work to build estimates of wealth using not only the public data that Sarah and I use, but restricted HRS data, which are very appealing conceptually to work with. There are some limitations, however. These are useful for estimating wealth ahead of claiming. They stop issuing any sorts of wealth estimates once a person does claim Social Security. So that's a little bit challenging for researchers like Sarah and myself that want to study how people are doing once they're retired. And then each of these different approaches uses different assumptions. And because of that, the data change a little bit, and the implications for some parts of the population on margins of, say, deciles or whatever are going to change over time. Now, as well, recent work has looked at whether or not people close to death are in hardship as they enter very late retirement. Perturba, Venti, and Weiss find that households that are typically households that were at risk of financial difficulty in very late retirement were typically in difficulty ahead of that as well, which is not the best result, but it speaks to the idea that this isn't necessarily a mismanagement problem in retirement. Our sample frame. We're going to look at respondents or spouses that were in the original HRS cohort. Now, that means that they were aged 51 to 61 in 1992, the years near retirement. And in 1996, they were 55 to 65, so they were right on that brink of retirement. In 2016, that would make them 75 to 85 years old. That's a pretty substantive period of retirement, again, about 20 years. We're going to estimate our household's wealth in each wave, and we're going to construct 3 new per capita measures of wealth from just the public HRS data. The first is going to be a present value of Social Security income, looking at income reports. The second is going to be a present value of defined benefit, pension, and annuity income. And the third is going to be estimating their DC balances. And to do this, we're going to work with those fuller data sets, the 1996 and 2016 RAND FAT files. And the reason we work with those is because they include the prior job balances as well. Unfortunately, the public HRS panel data do not include these prior job balances. And then we're going to add in the various sundry wealth components from the RAND panel data collection, which are very useful and very handy to use. Now, when it comes to self-reported Social Security income data, we're going to compute wealth as follows. We're going to take the Social Security wealth per capita, so this is for a person in any wave, W. It's going to be equal to the sum of the respondent and the spousal Social Security wealth. And that's because in the United States, your Social Security payment is a function of not only your own work record, but also that of your spouse, if you have a spouse. And then just to go through the rest of this here, that's going to be the present value and wage in wave W of the first next observation of Social Security wealth. Let me explain that. That means that let's say that it's 1996 and you have not claimed Social Security yet. We're going to go and look at when you first observe a reported income in Social Security. Let's say that's 2004. We'll take that 2004 number, we'll weight it by pricing. This is the CPI, and now the wave 1996 over CPI in 2004. Bring that back, get a present value for what it would have been in 1996, take that summation, and then divide it by the number of people in the household. If you have a spouse, that's 2. If you don't, that's 1. We look at self-reported DB, pension, and annuity income data in a way that's quite similar. You'll notice this. So it's the same summation, except instead of Social Security payments, here we just have the reported defined benefit, pension, and annuity income payment, DBPAI. And otherwise, all the moving components are the same. Now, for DC pension wealth, what we do is a little different. We look at the RAND panel data and we take the self-reported balances there for up to 4 reports, right? So we get up to 4 different reports, depending on which wave we're using, just from the panel data. But a fundamental challenge for these is retirement. And that is because the question is designed as follows. What is your defined benefit pension worth at your current job? And of course, if you're in retirement, that module is entirely skipped. So we have a challenge there in the normal RAND panel data. To address this, we use those FAT files, as I mentioned before, and we use a last best information approach as follows. So we start with current reports, the amount in pension now, and most of the sample answers that question just fine. But if that's unknown, declined, or refused, then we're going to check both a bracketed amount for now values. That is that they ask, would you say it's between A and B? Would you, et cetera, et cetera? Or we're also going to use what was the amount when you left that job. Now, if the bracketed amount now if B, the amount when left, is between the upper and lower brackets of the estimated now values, we're going to take B as the pension value. Notice that that's probably less than what the pension's worth now if it's been accruing any sort of improvements in value, normally like equities increase in value, this sort of thing. If we don't have a B in that range, then what we're going to do is we're going to take just the average of the upper and the lower estimate, unless the upper estimate is unknown. And in that case, we're going to take the lower estimate plus $1. Now, the whole motivation here is to keep that number to be a circumspect estimate of the defined contribution pension wealth. These enhanced data offer roughly $23,750 in new pension wealth per capita from defined contribution pensions, though of course the distribution of this wealth is not uniform. All right, just to give an idea of how this is working, in this we see the initial RAND panel data, and this is what happens when we include the full HRS data. This is for 2016, this one right here. And you can see these differences here between the 13,370 estimate just using the RAND panel data and this larger estimate here once we've done our work. For other wealth, we're going to use the RAND panel data. We have a small issue with some of the IRA estimates in there. That's an active area of research for us right now in discussion with RAND. But otherwise, let's get to the results. First, we're going to show you some absolute results. That's going to be per capita wealth, and it's going to adjust for changes in household composition over time, net asset values. Then we're going to show you some relative wealth, and that's going to be the evolution of individuals' wealth relative to the 1996 value. And then finally, we're going to talk about mobility. That is to say, the evolution of individuals' relative placement in the wealth distribution over time. Okay, so these are the absolute measures of wealth, and this is quite the table, I'm sure, but I want to emphasize the 1996 and the 2016 columns because, of course, this is where we've done our added wealth enhancement for the defined contribution pension wealth. You can see here the jump between there shows you just how important the work is, and in particular, that the distinction here, or the amount that's been drawn down in this wealth over time, is not that large. Notice that for DC wealth, the medians here are 0. That is because for this generation, defined contribution pension arrangements would not have overlapped with their careers to a very great extent in the United States. Of course, people my age and younger will have much more significant overlap with defined contribution pensions. But for those that have them in this realm, we see that's a very interesting result, somewhat reassuring. In terms of total wealth, going back over here, we see medians dropping from about $513,000 to about $401,000. That's a pretty big drop, about 20%, but it shows that at ages 75 to 85, that there's still substantive wealth that these households in the US hold on median. And then going forward, we can also look at the assets other than the present value of OASI, that's Social Security, employer pensions and annuities. And you see that these assets have actually grown. And a lot of that is described by housing assets. As well, we can show you IRA assets here. Importantly, IRA assets, you're going to see, while on the mean, they're increasing, in median, they're actually dropping. And what's happening here is an interaction with US law. So this is just based on required distributions from these plans. Now, in terms of relative measures, here's what we look at when we see total wealth over time. This is our 0 point, 1996, and using weighted population sample averages, we find a decline of 3.7% over that long 20-year period. And using medians, there's that 20% or 21%, 22% result that I showed you on the last slide. Housing wealth, this is driving some very positive experiences for households in this time period. Now, looking at Social Security, defined benefit, and annuity wealth, What you're going to see here, this is Social Security. Again, we're going to evaluate it normalizing to there. There's total wealth as a frame for you to remind you of what's going on from the last slide. And this is what's happening with defined benefit and annuity wealth over time. It's dropping by quite a bit more than Social Security wealth. Our explanation for this is it's probably likely due to a lack of inflation protections, and also not all people choose spousal benefits, protected spousal benefits. Mobility of wealth is the last thing we'll cover. So first, to just orient you to this matrix, this is what the wealth looked like in terms of which decile a person was in 1996. And this 20 years later is where they actually land. And so this would be in the middle between 5 and 6 in either case. Let's say you started off in the lowest wealth decile in 1996. In 2016, 44% chance that you stayed there. And all the way through to the sort of rags to riches stories here. And you'll see very few people, if any, do that. The opposite's true as well. People don't really go from riches to rags. So 47% chance of staying in the 10th decile, 1% chance of dropping. That's 1% if you were in the 10th decile, not 1% overall. So overall, just under 60% remain within one decile, and almost 80% have a decline that is no greater than one decile. No decline greater than one decile. Okay, so in summary, our objective was to improve understanding of how people in the US manage their resources in retirement. Our approach was to consider a holistic view of how per capita wealth evolved in retirement. And our findings address the issue that absolute measures show components move differently. Our response, so look at them together. We find that relative measures show that wealth declines moderately over retirement. And we find that mobility measures indicate large changes are relatively rare, but they do occur. Overall, we find that households generally maintain their wealth as they age, which is very reassuring given the concerns and dimensions that we talked about at the beginning of this program. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're in the US, good morning. And this is Ongoing Wealth, so we welcome any comments and questions, Sarah and I.
Please join me in thanking Jason. That was very interesting. And I would now like to introduce our third speaker of this session and our last speaker of our online conference, Jordan Moore. And Jordan is from Rowan University, also in the US.
Thank you. I'm Jordan Moore. I'm a finance professor at Rowan University, which is out in New Jersey in the USA. Thank you to all the Australians for staying up late to hear us Americans, and try not to put you to sleep with my presentation today. And thank you to the ARC for the invitation, and thank you to Hazel for chairing the session. So today I'm going to talk about my research on experiments on targeted wealth management for prospect theory investors. So in my research paper, I examine a different type of allocation problem than typical investment managers face. If you think about hiring a typical investment or wealth manager, you tell them you want to maximize expected returns subject to some maximum risk, and you tell them you could choose, specific asset classes or individual securities. So my approach is a little bit different. This paper is an experimental paper, which is a follow-up to a paper called Targeted Wealth Management for Prospect Theory Investors, which is a pure theory paper that I published last year in Journal of Wealth Management. And so what the theory looks at is, let's take a manager and allow them to move either account inflows or outflows over time within some period. For example, a manager charges 1% fee over a calendar year. Instead of charging that fee equally every month or quarter, they can choose when in that year to charge the fee. And the idea is, we'll talk about how this fits in with prospect theory, but the idea is that when you charge the fee will influence the subjective utility of the investor. In other words, your investors will be happier. They'll be willing to invest more in your funds in the future. And this is good for everyone. It's good for the investors who increase their savings and their situation that they're going to be in retirement. It's good for the managers because the managers want people to invest more because they receive a percentage of assets under management. So this paper is about developing a laboratory experiment. So I've done a preliminary experiment. I'll talk about those results today to test the theoretical findings in this paper that manipulating the timing of fees over the course of the calendar year is something that could influence the utility, the perceived quality of investment management. So I want to just talk a little bit about the underlying assumptions to the theory paper that I've written. One key assumption is that the manager has the discretion to actually charge fees at certain times rather than charging a fixed fee each month or quarter. So this is applicable to not only self-managed accounts, but this is also applicable to possibly accounts that have governments that are government regulated. For example, the gigantic superannuation system out there in Australia. Potentially, if the Australian government allowed for some of these discretions on behalf of managers, this would be something that would be able to be implemented at a very large level. We know that managers always have the ability to defer fees because fiduciary responsibility says you do what's in the best interest of the client. So you could always charge fees later. So there is some ability to implement these findings that I'm going to show you. Another big assumption is that the client has prospect theory preferences. There's been a number of research papers that show that investors do seem to react and rate the quality of investments, bets, etc., based more on prospect theory than traditional economic, maybe log utility theory. And so a key feature of prospect theory is that rather than maximizing utility of wealth at some future point, you maximize utility of a sequence of gains and losses, and investors are particularly susceptible to losses. So this is a big part of what drives my findings. I also assume that the client measures gains and losses and changes in total account balance from month to month or quarter to quarter. And in other words, over some period of time, there's three drivers of changes in account balance. One is investment returns. One is any contributions that the employee or employer might put in the account. And another is various outflows, whether they're fees or distributions. And I argue that the investor is really just going to look at the account balance and the previous account balance and make a decision about how the account did based on those pieces of data, right? We talk about salience a lot in behavioral finance. The account balance is attention grabbing. You open up a physical letter in the mail, or you go online to your broker's website. What you're going to look at is the account balance. And you're likely also, we know from various behavioral papers, you're likely to be anchored to the previous balance. So you're likely to have in your mind an expectation of, did this account go up or down since the last time I looked at it? So I want to show you something that maybe a lot of you are familiar with, the prospect theory value function, which basically says, this is the utility of, this is what an investor feels subjectively based on the performance of an account since the last time they looked at it. So there's some return on the horizontal axis, and a higher return is always better, but you can see here investors are much more sensitive to losses than gains, right? They hate losses 2.25 times as much as they like gains. There's also some differences in convexity and concavity over losses versus gains. That's sort of harder to see in this picture. But one thing I've done is I've taken this picture and said, what are the implications of this in terms of what you might call marginal gains? And I think this is sort of interesting. This is basically the first derivative of the prospect theory value function. It says, how much more are investors happy if you get 1 extra percent on your account, depending on how the account's doing before that. And so what you can see is, since investors really hate losses, added performance that wipes out a loss is much more valuable than added performance that increases a gain. And this has big implications, right? So I analyze in this paper the implications of manipulating the timing of management fees. And so a management fee on top of an existing loss is especially painful, right? If your account already loses money and then your manager charges a fee, that fee really hurts. That's an extra loss. Whereas if your account's up a bunch of money and your manager charges a fee, we already know that you don't care that much about differences in making, 10% versus 11%. So that fee does not hurt very much in, utility or happiness terms. So this is the variation based on the prospect theory value function that I exploit in my theory paper and that I test out in this experimental paper. So in the theory paper, I basically solve for the manager's optimal strategy. I say we're going to look at a sequence of typical historical quarterly or monthly returns that you might observe and decide what the manager would do with the idea of maximizing expected prospect theory utility. I construct what I call equivalent strategies. In other words, two strategies that produce the same utility, expected utility from the standpoint of the investor. And I show, for example, that a 1% fee applied in this optimal way, where you charge the 1% at the best possible time, namely when the account has a big gain, generates the same expected utility as a 0.67% fee applied just equally over months or over quarters. And so these differences suggest potential gains from trade. In other words, suggest the ability for managers to time, potentially even charge clients interest-free loans so that they can make contributions early, or defer fees and apply those fees at the optimal times, and make investors potentially a lot happier and therefore potentially willing to invest more, which is good for them and good for the managers as well. We know from Jason and Sarah's organization, the ICI, that there's a lot of money that's managed professionally, right? There's over, US $25 trillion in mutual funds and exchange traded funds alone, right? So these are vehicles that could potentially have rules changed that allow managers to implement fee structures or contribution structures in this way. And that could potentially have a big impact. We know that many individual investors and households don't save nearly enough to retire. We also know that behavioral finance and changes to choice architecture have a lot of potential to address problems in under savings and a number of other problems. So the way I think about this sort of policy change that I'm proposing in this paper is, if Thaler and Bernardsey in 2004 developed the Save More Tomorrow plan, where people pledge to save more in the future and then they sort of automatically follow those plans when the future comes. I think of this as, save more today. So how do you just change the choice architecture of the investment management system to get investors to just want to save more, which is, like I said, pretty much good for everyone. So in this paper, I designed and as I said, I ran a sort of an early stage experiment to test these strategies. So we will have some results to look at. The framework is that a randomized controlled trial setup. So I have about 400 subjects. They're randomly assigned to either a control group or a treatment group. I recruited these subjects on Amazon Mechanical Turk. There's a number of papers that show that Amazon Mechanical Turk is able to generate a lot of findings well known in the behavioral literature. So this is a good venue for recruiting large, diverse pools of subjects. I'll show you an example of the task, but basically each subject completes 10 tasks, 10 trials, where they observe a year of quarterly returns for some mutual fund, some risky asset. And they're told after that, you've got $100,000, you can invest some portion in this risky asset that you just saw last year's returns, and you can invest some portion in the risk-free asset. In the case of the treatment group, the fees are applied using these targeted strategies to maximize perceived utility. In the control group, fees are applied equally every quarter. So here's an example of what one trial for each of the groups. So in both cases, we say, here's the performance for the mutual fund for the last 4 quarters. We show you 4 quarters of returns, and there's a top line number of gross returns, there's a fee, and then there's the net return, which is just gross return minus fee. And you can see here that in the case of the control group, the fee is just 0.25 every quarter. In the case of the treatment group, the fee is 1% all in 1 quarter. And in this particular example, the first quarter, the portfolio got off to a great start and made 6%. And the manager just said, I'm going to charge the fee now because the client's going to be happy with 5, just like they'll be happy with 6. And then I won't have to charge the fee for the rest of the year. In either case, the subject in the experiment observes this screen and then gets asked, what percentage would you like to invest in the mutual fund? Select between 0 and 100%. The rest will be invested in the certificate of deposit, which you're told is going to get 2% guaranteed. So what we want to measure here is basically a treatment dummy variable. Our dependent variable is just the percentage of investment in the mutual fund after observing the quarterly returns. And as I said, what we care about is the treatment dummy, which is basically going to pick up the differential or the additional amount of risky asset investment, given that you observe these portfolio returns, which are managed in an optimal way. Other controls that I expect to matter include the performance of the risky fund that you observe, right? So in some trials, you see that the fund went up 18%, and you're probably going to be more likely to buy it than other trials when you see the fund, maybe lost money. We expect to see a negative, implication of risk, which I measure using just the maximum minus minimum quarterly return. And we expect some differential with regards to demographics, such as, gender, age, income, education. These have all been things that have been shown to predict investment behavior. We expect some implications of psychological variables, which we asked about as well. So things like risk aversion and degree of trust in the markets. That's what we expect to influence willingness for stock market participation as well. So sort of a boring picture, just 2 bars on a page, but got to show this, and it just says, okay, out of the 200 groups, out of the 200 subjects that were in the treatment group, they selected an average of 58% investment in the mutual fund going forward. Subjects in the control group only wanted to purchase 51%. That's a pretty big difference. I want to point out that each group, each subject, regardless of what group they were in, saw the exact same sequence of quarterly returns in all 10 trials. The only difference was how fees were applied throughout the year. One concern is the possibility that even though we assign subjects to treatment or control randomly, that there could be systematic differences between the groups, especially in some variable that's likely to predict stock market participation, such as gender, for example. Barbara and Odin show that men are more likely to take risk and invest more in risky assets, among other papers. And so I using these key variables, I show here just that the p-value between for a test for differences in means between the 2 groups. In all of these cases, these p-values are well above 0.1, indicating that there's no significant difference in important demographic or psychological characteristics across the 2 groups. So this chart shows my main result, which is that after you include various controls, this treatment dummy is statistically significant at the 5% level in all 4 of these specifications. So in the first specification, the treatment dummy is the only variable that we look at. When we include historical return characteristics of the fund, so the fact that across the trials, sometimes the fund does better or worse, sometimes the risk is higher or lower. We get the sort of directions that we expect. But the significance of the treatment dummy and sign is very stable. In the third specification, we add these demographic variables. these main ones, right? Age, education, income, gender, race. The only one with statistically significant results is gender. So, you know, with this in the sample, right, men, basically this means that men holding all these other variables constant would pick, you know, 3 to 4% more stocks than women, which is consistent with previous findings. And then in the fourth specification, we add some psychological variables, so risk aversion, financial literacy, trust. These are all based on questions that we ask in the survey. And so you see that even in this specification, one thing that I thought was interesting was the significance on gender goes away and is replaced with a negative and significant finding on risk aversion. So the degree to which men are more likely to hold a higher percentage of stocks really has to do with the fact that men on average are less risk averse or more risk loving. So when you explicitly include risk aversion measures in the experiment, that sort of subsumes the gender effect, which I thought was interesting. But overall, this differential investment in risky assets is very stable and significant at about 7% difference in all four of these specifications, which includes the full range of control variables. So just to summarize what I did today, I showed that, you know, there seems to be, in addition to the theory, some experimental evidence that there's an advantage to optimizing the structures of fund flows, whether they're, in this example, outflows like management fees, but potentially inflows as well. So even having clients maybe have some initial holding account that they put their client contributions or their employer contributions in, and then sort of apply those contributions at optimal times to replace losses in the account rather than add to gains is something that could add value as well. I think that targeting utility is a good thing because not only are you basically encouraging policies that make investors happier, but that happiness sort of benefits the financial managers or the government, whoever is basically benefiting as well from having individuals, investors invest more. So we have a lot of evidence that shows that in general, better choice architecture is a good way to increase savings. So this is just an example of a different change to choice architecture potentially that has the ability to maybe significantly improve savings and retirement outcomes for individual investors and households. So next steps, I haven't decided. I'm still presenting this at conferences and hearing comments. Maybe I'm going to continue to run the existing experiment with more people, or maybe I'm going to make some modifications if I get comments that make me feel like I need to make some changes. But in any case, sort of finalize this paper and publish it. Ideally, really try to find partners to do some sort of field experiment, whether that's a government that's responsible for pensions, like superannuation, or whether it's a institution that's responsible for managing funds. I think in theory it'd be cool. I haven't come up with a good idea yet, but to try to identify using the mutual fund data, some kind of natural experiment, some kind of cases where mutual funds happen to be managing themselves more or less optimally for one reason or another. Again, haven't really started that part of it yet, but focus now on just finalizing this laboratory experiment and trying to develop some more empirical support for my theoretical findings in the previously published paper. So I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance today, and if you have any questions outside of the session, that's my email, and I'd welcome hearing any future questions or comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jordan.